Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us here at the Atlantic Council. My name is Reed Blakemore. I'm the Director of Research and Programs at the Atlantic Council's Global Energy Center. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this event this morning, Transmission 2026, which is the second annual iteration of an event series we've been doing here at the Global Energy Center, which aims to address key topics on grid infrastructure, looking out to the year ahead and discussing solutions that enable efficient and cost-effective build-out of the power system. The conversations we're going to have this morning on several issues related to the power grid are an increasingly critical subject in energy that I think we all recognize has really entered the public consciousness over the past 16 months and is likely to become a critical issue as we think ahead to midterms later this November. The need to upgrade and expand the power grid to replace aging infrastructure and meet growing energy demand has long been recognized by the industry. But now the emergence of new large loads, data infrastructure, and its impacts on grid reliability and affordability have increased attention to the issue and made the need for solutions even more urgent than they were just a few years ago. Long lead times for grid and generation components like gas turbines and power transformers, inefficient permitting processes, markets that are not providing sufficient signals or revenue to new and oftentimes existing generators, regulatory lag that can inhibit the implementation of innovative grid solutions, and quickly growing power bills for consumers are among the core challenges facing electricity sector companies and policymakers in 2026. At the same time, regulatory reforms and their implementation by power system stakeholders, state and federal government measures to protect consumers, while ensuring the build out of power infrastructure and enabling growth in AI infrastructure, emerging partnerships across the private and public sector, transmission expansion plans led by utilities and regional transmission organizations, and innovation across the electricity network demonstrates the number of ongoing efforts to devise solutions to these challenges. Designing a cost-effective, reliable, and abundant supply of electricity is not a one-and-done effort, and it requires consistent reevaluation and constant innovation. We're joined today by a group of expert speakers who are working on these issues every day and really deep-seated in what is ultimately an incredibly wonky but urgent subject. Our first panel is going to focus on how utilities recover their costs via tariff design, which we have generally referred to as rate making, and how to connect both new generators and new demand sources onto the power grid as effectively and efficiently as we possibly can. Following our first panel, we'll also have keynote remarks from FERC Commissioner David Rosner before moving on to our second panel, which will discuss how utilities and operators plan their system for future needs, the impact that demand growth from data centers has on planning, and how electricity markets can adapt to ensure electricity markets remain competitive while providing proper incentives to ensure that supply can meet demand without unduly costing electricity customers by overbuilding and overcharging. We'll then finish our session today with a fireside chat with Ian Magruder, founder and executive director of the Utilize Coalition, a new industry coalition comprised of Google, Tesla, and others with a goal of saving consumers $100 billion through improved grid utilization. With that, I'd like to remind everyone that we are live streaming and on the record today. You will have the opportunity to ask questions live and in person or through askac.org. And we're really looking forward to where this conversation takes us forward as the Global Energy Center explores more work on power grid, transmission, and how to balance large loads in an increasingly competitive environment associated with reshoring and data infrastructure demand. With that, I'd love to ask our panelists for the first session to join me on stage, where we'll start our discussion on interconnecting new generation and load to the grid, tariff and rate design issues, all of which are coming to the forefront this year. Okay, you guys are already here. So, before I had the opportunity to even introduce you, well, no, I wanted to actually introduce you as efficiently as possible, but I'm joined on stage by Christina Hayes, Executive Director for Americans for a Clean Energy Grid, Aaron Troncoso, a Senior Policy Advisor for the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, and Matthew Satterwhite, Senior Vice President and Head of U.S. Policy and Regulatory Strategy at National Grid. Thank you guys for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
I think I want to start with this idea of the cost of accomplishing what we need to accomplish here, building out the grid. We're all aware of the ways in which the price tag associated with building out the grid, modernizing the grid, has begun to trickle down to consumers. And so we've now recently had a lot of discussion, a lot of statements and commitments associated with how data centers will pay for their own power. But that's a little trickier than I think it is at first glance, because you have to navigate the numerous regulators, operators, and stakeholders involved in the power system to ensure fair cost allocation. So, Christina, I might start with you. How do we navigate that system and establish fair cost allocation? And in particular, are there distinct tariffs or pricing structures needed to ensure that the large loads we're putting onto the grid do more to help share the costs that they're creating?
I really appreciate you bringing that up as a way to kind of set the table for what we're talking about today. As we think about power costs and how they are going up in everyone's bills, it's helpful to break it down to the different components, right? So there's generation, there's the power piece, there's distribution, and there's transmission. I think capacity markets generation has gotten a lot of the attention lately, right? With PJM capacity market prices going through the roof, resulting in, we've heard things like Congressman Pallone talk about an extra $20, $25 charge per month for his constituents for power. And that is certainly hitting people in the pocketbook. Transmission is a part of that, so it is helpful to think about it in chunks. Now thinking about how we need to build out the grid for organic growth as well as large loads. I was at an SPP event not too long ago where they talked about, they project they're going to need to double the capacity of their grid from about 56 gigawatts to something like 110. But of that doubled growth, they expect about half of that to be attached to large loads and the other half attached to increased manufacturing, increased electrification, organic growth, a lot of these other factors. And so it's worth it to remember that we have an older grid, an aging grid that's going to need to be upgraded regardless. And we actually benefit by having additional large loads on the system so that those upgraded costs can be shared among a broader range of customers, and that will push down the overall cost, as shown by the recent study by Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. And so as we think about transmission costs, again, yet a third factor that makes it really challenging is that those costs are identified and assessed through federal tariffs, but then they are allocated in a region to the utilities or to the zones, and then the utilities through a state-approved rate case will then allocate those transmission costs to their customers. And a lot of these large loads are still retail customers, and so you have that jurisdictional split that also adds to the complication. So now that I've introduced all of the complicating factors, I'm sure Matt would be delighted to.
Yeah, there's no hope. No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding. So yeah, the number of players involved and the costs involved make the problems that much harder. But if you look at the history of our system, there's always been hard problems to solve. Heck, even rural electrification was a big issue, had to be solved in the beginning. So when you look at it, the question usually comes down to, should we do large load tariffs that define everything so there's a clear policy and everybody knows exactly what's going on, or whether we should do special contracts and go case by case. I think both have worked in certain situations. It's a matter of what makes the most sense for a region, and you have to really look at that. I think there was at the last NARUC, there was the NARUC FERC task force meeting on affordability. There's some really good conversations there, and I think the state commissioners did a great job of just talking to FERC and saying, look, different things are going to work in different places, so let's not go all in on one or another. Let's borrow from each other, but let's let the states sort of say, here's what works in our region. And that works as long as there's action. And so you really have to look and make sure you're taking action and don't just be paralyzed by the big problem that's in front of you. So if you look at the cost, there's the local costs that someone has to hook up to the system if you're a large load. There's the regional cost that comes with hooking up that load sort of beyond sort of the radial that really provides them in the substation. And then there's the overall regional cost. And the question is, what does it mean for all of the above? How do you recover that? What do you call that? And I think a lot of the news stories out there, if you look closer, it is in different places. It is how much is covered in certain areas. And I think the special contracts, Some have these sort of and one plus one where they have to do a little bit more because they have more leeway there. But the state policies are looking closely at the tariffs that they have, are trying to define what that cost recovery is going to be. The difficulty is upgrades are going to cost different amounts. And so if you have a set tariff that just says we're going to recover this, and this is the way it's going to go, but the upgrade might cost more, does that really cover it? And so those are some of the hard questions I think you have to come to, but you want to be aligned with your state energy policy. You want to be aligned with your ISO, RTO, sorry South, let the South live, whatever they want to do on their own, and FERC. I mean, you really have to be aligned with all of them, and if they're not working together, we're going to fail. And so it really is, what I think I've seen is a desire, and this FERC commission now has said, please define things, please bring us things, because we want to be working together. So I'm hopeful, despite my first start of there's no hope.
Aaron, I want to bring you in this because I think one of the items Matthew mentioned is the role of state policy here. So, I mean, coming from the state of Pennsylvania, part of the dynamism we're seeing in PJM specifically here, when you think about these issues associated with fair cost allocation and the role of policy in terms of enabling that fair allocation, how's the state level work going? Can you give us a little bit of insight in terms of what your priorities are and how you're approaching the issue?
Yeah, absolutely. So cost allocation is really, is top of mind, both when we're, talking about getting new energy on the grid and the costs, as my fellow panelists have noted, of upgrading our aging grid infrastructure. I think we are all notionally maybe aligned on the idea that large loads should pay their own way. We are all generally aligned on the idea that our transmission system is, and our distribution system in many ways are outdated, need additional investment in order to bring us up to a more modern, more efficient grid that's able to cost effectively meet the challenge of large load. I think once you drill down sort of underneath that highest level, the questions get very thorny, very technical, very complicated. And we're seeing that right now in PJM. So the governor led a coalition, Governor Shapiro led a coalition of 13 governors in partnership with the White House to call for PJM to run an emergency auction for new, all of the above energy supply, and to figure out a process for allocating those costs to the individual large load cost causers. I think what my fellow panelists have touched on is it's really an all hands on deck situation to try to solve that problem. So at the RTO level, PJM is grappling with questions of who's paying for the auction, who is in and who is out, how are we allocating the risk associated with that auction if the large load involved in that auction doesn't actually show up. If we're procuring, PJM is claiming a 60 gigawatt shortfall in the next 10 years, what happens if it's only 40 gigawatts? Who's paying for that last 20 gigawatts? And is it fair to ask large loads to pay for that? And certainly I think from our perspective, it's not fair to ask existing residential and commercial customers to bear that risk. And so we're doing what we can to ensure that the risk does not fall on those customers. And then, of course, flowing down from the RTO level, the RTO only has, in PJM's case, generally the authority to allocate to the individual load-serving entities, the individual utility level. Once you get down to the level of the individual utilities, it becomes a question for the states and the state commissions in particular to try to answer how do we actually figure out a process to allocate those utility level costs down to the individual load cost causers, and that's incredibly complicated, as I'm appreciating more and more each day that I spend in Valley Forge. And then, of course, there are all the costs associated with the system build out. And I think a primary frame of mind we have to be in when we're thinking about that system build out is how do we make sure that all of the investments we're making are maximally cost effective? Because I think we are all in agreement that investments need to be made, but we need to make sure that we are not, building twice to solve the same problem. So if we're, building a transmission line and also building a generator to serve the same load, that's not a cost-effective investment. And in Pennsylvania, and I'm sure across the region, folks would agree that we don't have extra dollars to spare on investments that are not maximally efficient. So trying to figure out how can we squeeze as much as possible out of the grid? How can we make sure that we're building cost effectively that transmission distribution build out that we need, and making those upgrades where we need, and making sure that's co-optimized with generation and other investments.
Mm-hmm. I want to bring this idea back of this beneficiary pays kind of principle and within the context of fair cost allocation. Earlier this month we had the big announcement of the Ratepayer Protection Pledge, right? Which to my mind is a major signal from the hyperscaling community in particular, associated with the commitment they're willing to make in order to ensure that as they move into the system, they're not really creating massive additional costs to the consumer, to the taxpayer. But Christina, I might give you this question is, how do we actually think about implementing the Ratepayer Protection Pledge in the context of fair cost allocation, and how does that reflect how can we make that reflect a true reaffirmation of this beneficiary pays principle, which we've talked about in the past, but this means is the first kind of almost demand side signal towards that fair cost allocation?
That's a great question, especially when
I only ask great questions. We're at the Atlantic Council.
Absolutely. And especially when we think about it as applied to, again, generation, transmission, distribution. So thinking about with generation as large loads bring their own generation onto the system, that reduces some of the competitive pressures, I think, in some of the organized markets. You do still have competition between large loads seeking to procure, for instance, the equipment required for a natural gas plant or other generating facilities, and competing with utilities that may be seeking, or independent power producers seeking to procure that same equipment. So you do still have competition that is still going to have an impact on prices. So we can't expand the supply chain fast enough, really. As we think about that as applied to transmission, what I really get stuck on, honestly, is the timing question. So as you build out transmission, the costs are recovered from the customers who are on the system. As large loads are still coming onto the system, there's a bit of a lag between the customers who have driven some of the increased costs and the rate at which they are sharing in the costs. And so I think there's a bit of a timing question that needs to be addressed. Also, the potential for stranded costs. I know there are those who are concerned that if they plan for a very large system with facilities that may be there for a brief period of time and then say, oh, this is not for me. I'm from the Pacific Northwest, where we saw 8 aluminum smelters shut down in the space of about 2 years due to the Enron crisis, driving up power costs. And I know that in some places, there are these grave concerns that, if there was a glitch in the system of some kind, that some of the data centers could relocate and we could end up with stranded costs on the system. So again, thinking about that timing and making sure that there's that level of certainty so that utilities can build with confidence and make sure that costs are shared among all customers who are driving the increase in infrastructure.
And of course, this isn't just a new infrastructure conversation as well. I think there's equally a conversation we need to have about upgrades to the grid and the implementation of grid innovation technologies. And Matthew, I might turn to you on this question, which is how it feels like almost two slightly different issues, right? The challenge associated with the new grid infrastructure we need to take on these large loads, but we can't forget about the need to upgrade the grid we already have. Christina, as you mentioned, that the grid is, I use the word mature to be nice to the grid, right? And not just call it old, but we persistently had this.
Called it old.
Okay,
the president
fair.
called the grid old and tired. Go ahead.
But yes, old and tired, I'll go with mature. There has long been this persistent need to upgrade the grid, to modernize the grid. And that's independent of the new infrastructure we need to build out the grid to meet these large loads. How do we actually think about grid upgrading and advanced transmission technologies and things of that nature in tandem with our larger grid build out while still thinking through the cost effects of upgrading the grid in the first place?
Yeah, I mean, the good news about the emergency that we think we have in front of us really is that people are looking at all the above, what else we can add on, but you really can't ignore what you said initially. The grid needed upgrading regardless of the situation we're in right now. National Grid has transmission towers that date back to 1906 and 1908. Paul Revere wasn't quite there, but it seems like it's gone back. So that's very mature overall. So I think we have to really understand that the system is needed upgraded no matter what through time. The key is to plan, but not be paralyzed by plan. We have to take action. We have to make decisions. And it's building an investment is kind of like justice. I always say building delayed is building denied. And so we have to do something. We have to have some investment in the system while we're still looking at the other things that could help ease the pressure of what we're doing there. I can remember back, I think it was 2023, we were in Austin, Texas at NARUC. And I was on the last Wednesday morning panel, highly attended because it's the last day. But I remember I dropped my whole speech and I said, this is a landmark time in the industry because I go to both the NASUCA, which is the utility conference, NARUC, and the utilities are all there. And all of them were saying the same thing. We know we have to spend more. We know costs are going to go up. And that was just when data centers were really starting to take hold, and it was 110 degrees in Texas, so everyone knew resource adequacy. And I implored everyone to say, look, we have to work together as an industry because the people at home, the common person watching, they don't understand. All they understand is there's going to be more cost. And if we attack each other, then it's going to be impossible to make the investments that we need to make into the system. And that just got exacerbated then when the large loads came in. So, we need to probably lower the rhetoric a little bit and work together as an entire industry to make sure that we have those investments and we can make that investment because they have to be made. Otherwise, they're going to be much more expensive if we wait too long to get there. So what the large loads have done is a sort of an opportunity to help offset some of these costs. But we can't go out and sell everyone that it's this panacea that's going to pay for everything because the system is old and we have to invest in it. And we're kind of selling ourselves short and setting ourselves up for a future problem if we just say, don't worry, we got someone to pay for all of it and we're going to be fine. We have to make sure we're making smart decisions, using all the resources we can to lower the demand that's needed, but make those investments so that we can have the grid for the future that we need.
And actually, Aaron, I want to come to you and want you to jump in this conversation, but I might preview an additional question with you. Is Matthew, you mentioned industry needs to work together, but it also strikes me that we need to work regionally as well. We have so Aaron, we started with you on kind of how you're tackling this issue in the context of Pennsylvania, but how is Pennsylvania actually working with its other state level counterparts to address these issues?
Yeah, and we'll definitely tackle that, but I'm going to ignore that for a second and just build on what Matt said, which is, on the point about making smart investments in our grid, I think, and totally agree that we need to make those investments. One good example of sort of the dynamic I'm talking about, where we need to make sure that we're making efficient investments is, in advanced conductors. And I think I hear too many people talking about the need for advanced conductors without really specifying what they mean by that. You can have an advanced conductor that is, 5 times the cost for 2.5, 3 times the capacity, or you can have an advanced conductor that is, 1.5 times the cost for twice the capacity. And so I think in, our state, we are focused on, and we've got legislation advancing on grid enhancing technologies, advanced transmission technologies. We're making sure that, in this environment where we need to be spending what we need to on the grid, but we need to, consumers don't have infinite dollars to pour into the system. We need to make sure that those investments are cost effective, that we are including those second generation conductor technologies when we're thinking about doing those grid upgrades, in a cost-effective way, trying to maximize the value of every dollar. And I guess to get back to your first question, your original question on, how are we working together on a regional basis? Governor Shapiro launched the PJM Governors Collaborative, which is a group of all of the PJM governors working together on these issues. I think there's a surprising amount of alignment on the questions of cost allocation, a surprising amount of agreement on what we need to do to move the grid forward, and are now operationalizing a request we made along with the White House to run an emergency auction for electricity supply to make significant reforms to the PJM market. I think we're all also in agreement on some of the challenges of interconnection. As my fellow panelists have noted, there's a lot of planning that happens and much less building than there needs to be. And so, we are working together as states to push PJM to speed up its interconnection process even beyond what they have sort of promised to already do. We think a lot has been made possible by artificial intelligence and automation tools to try to speed up that planning process. I think we would really like to have PJM lean a little more onto the operations side, and especially in the case of load that is, electrically adjacent, for example, to generation, we think planning times could be significantly cut down. And so trying to take those novel solutions and push them forward as a group of governors, using the power of the bully pulpit to advocate and to have PJM actually move forward with some of the things we've been advocating for has been a key part of the strategy. But from the vantage of a governor's office, we don't have direct control over cost allocation, especially in a state like Pennsylvania, where our Public Utilities Commission is independent. And sort of does makes those decisions within the commission. What we have is the power of our voice and our joint advocacy, and we've been trying to maximize that, as well as pushing forward legislation that would get new supply on the grid, cut permitting timelines. We've taken executive action to do that as well. The governor's launched a permit fast track program, cut permitting timelines, and eliminated the permit backlog at our Department of Environmental Protection, and trying to basically do everything that we can on an executive level, push forward on the legislative level, at the state level as well, and do that advocacy where we can on the regional and federal level.
Mm-hmm. It's been brought up a few times, and so I want to touch on this issue of speed to interconnection, the time to interconnection, and speed to power, because I think that's one of the consistent themes that we hear out of the data center developer community in particular. But before I do that, I want to remind everyone, if you do have a question, we are taking live audience questions, so raise your hand and I'll eventually find you as I pan the room. But you can also ask questions via our online platform at askac.org. So with that prompt now in the ether, I do want to turn to the timed interconnection question. Approval for timed interconnection has been a consistent barrier for generators, and now large load customers are directly impacted as well. One of the items I think we've seen more and more regularly is data centers turning to behind-the-meter solutions, right? And I think that's introduced a new dynamic and to think about how we manage the grid overall. So, Christina, I might ask you to help us level set here. What are the advantages, disadvantages, and risks and opportunities associated with on-grid versus behind-the-meter solutions? As ultimately we see a market response to the stresses with the grid we're seeing in the first place.
I'm feeling very triggered right now.
I'm sorry.
This is one of my serious bugaboos, and I have a personal story actually to tell to kind of relate to why this bothers me so much. I was on a trip, a family trip. It was in a national park in a country, another part of the world, and we're going through this area, and there are these big transmission towers. And I asked the local person, what do you think of these big transmission towers? Knowing the United States, it's terrible on the landscape. This is a treasured area. And she said, I hate them. And I was like, and this is the answer I'm expecting. She said, because they serve the mining companies and they go right past the communities. They don't serve the local towns that they go right past. And they only have a few hours of electricity a day. And that's it. And so when I think about this islanding brought to an extreme, we could really have two separate grids. And that is a waste of money. That is a waste of resources on so many levels in terms of procuring additional generation and not being able to dispatch it to those who need it most. And so I feel very strongly, I appreciate that it's very important to have that speed to power, to be able to build. I worry about conflating the generation and load interconnection because those are different jurisdictionally. Generation interconnection is federal and load interconnection is often a state function. I know that's a topic that's up for discussion now, but I feel very strongly that while islanding may work in the short run, that long term there's great value and reliability and cost effectiveness for not just large loads, but also every customer on the grid by making sure that there's broad integration.
Matthew, I want to bring you in on this question of behind the meter, on grid, off grid. From your perspective, how should we be interpreting the reality of those solutions increasingly becoming prevalent, I think, with balancing the very issues that Christina mentioned?
Yeah, so before National Grid, I was at American Electric Power, where a lot of this was sort of hitting us in the face in real time and trying to react. And I can tell you the initial preference was not to go behind the meter, but I think circumstances have driven companies there. I mean, it's a national security issue, it's a speed issue. There's lots of issues that make more of the all of the above in other areas is sort of an all of the above here. What I'm concerned about with that is, when I used to work for the Public Utilities Commission of Ohio, and there was a huge outage in Ohio. And the interconnected grid allowed us to do things and work with companies to make sure that everybody was taken care of. There was not lying, when you milk the cows, they're hooked up to electric machines to make sure the milk flows. And there was a co-op that they couldn't get power to them. The co-op was down. And so we, as the state commission, called and said, AEP, what can you do? Because everything was connected, we were able to divert things and make sure the cows got milked and they didn't dry up and completely destroy this dairy farm that was there. So while behind the meter can work, and it might be where we have to go for certain things, I'm a big believer in the overall grid being able to control things and help things. The other thing I think of is, for those of you that know Bob Bradish from AEP, we would have a lot of these discussions on behind the meter, what it means for the grid. And I would come in as the attorney with all these policy discussions. And he would just look at me and say, hey, Matt, physics matter. Physics are important. We can make all these plans, but something behind the meter, if it's still connected to the grid, physics are still there. There are impacts for everything. FERC has talked about this. Others have talked about this. So it sounds like an easy fix for something, but really the physics are still there unless it's completely isolated, completely off, which wouldn't help the overall greater community. The physics are still something we have to deal with.
Mm-hmm. Is there a policy solution available off the shelf to help us kind of address the behind the meter off-grid dynamic we're seeing out there? Or is this really just kind of markets being markets? I think that's a simple question. But.
I mean, you could make a policy if someone wanted to be completely off the grid, and I think that's been considered before, and why some things didn't move forward, because it was technically saying it was behind the meter, but it was still connected to the grid. If they have the right to go completely behind the meter if they want, but most companies realize that probably isn't the full answer. It might be the initial way to get something started, but they still want to be connected for that safety and to provide to the community as well. To your point, someone doesn't want to say we're behind the meter and a 90-90 boo-boo, kind of we got the power here and you don't. I don't think that's a policy legal term, 90-90 boo-boo. So I don't think they want that either. So it doesn't sort of fit the overall structure of what good policy would be. So you can do things, it's just difficult for the 15 issues you have on the board you're trying to solve for. Mm-hmm. It might solve for 2 or 3, but then you got the 12 or 13 others.
I actually am hoping to take your question and kind of pull it inside out, because I think going behind the meter is an indictment of the grid and how quickly we are able to connect generation, how quickly we're able to connect load. And so I would rather see the attention that's being paid towards islanding, towards and redirect it towards how can we make it more efficient, more rapid to interconnect to the broader grid.
Mm-hmm. There are places it will work, and it's probably the only solution for some things, and we need to be open to broad solutions.
Of course. Aaron, bringing you on this question.
Yeah, and just to get back to, I think, a point Christina originally made, there's this Lawrence Berkeley study that sort of showed connecting new load to the grid can actually be more affordable because they share in the costs of upgrading the grid and bringing new supply online, and that only works if supply can actually get online to meet that new load. Mm-hmm. We were talking about a period of much slower load growth, but we've met the moment in terms of building new supply before, and we really should be able to do so here again. But in the PJM region, projects that came online this year took, I think, an average of 8 years to come online. In the hyperscaler world, that's an eternity, and so people are turning to behind the meter out of necessity. If we could connect those projects, perhaps on a provisional basis, provisional interconnection, and sort of lean more on the operational side of managing electricity flows a little more, as they do in Texas and in other regions. SPP just put out something that was approved by FERC. Mm-hmm. In that vein, I think we would be in a much better situation. But PJM's interconnection queue has been frozen for several years. So projects that are currently still waiting in the queue, still frozen, which will reopen hopefully in April. I think entered the queue 3 or 4 years ago. So, a completely different world. Those projects face a much different economic situation. That leads to more projects dropping out, more uncertainty, more delays. It's a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. So I think what we have advocated for is a wholesale rethinking of the interconnection queue, leveraging all available modern tools to try to speed that up. Try to do creative things like connecting things quickly that are electrically adjacent, leaning more on the operational side. We are ready to work with PJM on speeding that up.
We do have one question from the audience, which is really about state energy policy and the ability to provide resource adequacy. So I'll read it verbatim, which is, does the panel have any thoughts on the impact of state-driven energy policy on the ability to provide sufficient resources as large loads grow, particularly in RTOs? Any thoughts from the group? Anybody want to jump on that one? Maybe Aaron, I might jump to you as our state level representative.
Yeah, I feel like Pennsylvania's been the good citizen here. If you look at the net, additions of capacity megawatts to the grid in the last decade, I think Pennsylvania has like 3.5 gigawatts, and the next biggest state in PJM has something like 900 megawatts. So, we are doing our part in terms of connecting new energy sources to the grid. The governor's an all of the above energy governor. I think he recognizes we need resources of all kinds to meet the moment of load growth. I can't speak to the policies of other states.
As we kind of wrap up this session, which I think has been a great scene setter for the entire event today, I do want to do one last lightning round, if you will. Which is really, get excited. Which is really, this event is called Transmission 2026. And obviously, I think what we're trying to do with this is look ahead to the year and identify how this space is going to shift and evolve, and what policymakers, industry stakeholders, the think tank community, if I'm being a little self-aggrandizing, how all of these different communities should be thinking about these issues moving forward. I'll go down the line starting with Christina. In your mind, what is the one area that we as a community of stakeholders should be really focused on in order to solve the problem, or at least make some headway to solve the problem in 2026?
The biggest event coming up this year is compliance with Order 1920. A number of the compliance filings are due to come in later this year, and a well-planned regional and interregional grid is still the most cost-effective and reliable way to drive down costs and to build out the grid, to provide that headroom on the system to more quickly and efficiently interconnect generation and load. So I would say that 1920 compliance and generally looking to broad regional planning continues to be the most important element.
Mm-hmm. Matthew?
I think FERC has done a good job saying action has to happen. And ISOs, RTOs, the wild, wild south, everyone knows they have to do something to kind of act as soon as possible. And I think we need to give them the space to do that, but it has to happen quickly. And what I like about what FERC has done is they've said, we can do something, or you can tell us what the best thing is to do. And so I think we need to give everyone the space to take FERC up on their offer and say, these are the best ideas, and we're going to bring them to you, and this is what works in our region. And that collaboration of the state and the federal system working together is really what's going to solve the problem versus one or the other overbalancing.
Aaron?
And I guess I'll leave you with two thoughts. I think first, fair rules on cost allocation are really non-negotiable for us. The cost of bringing new supply online, doing the transmission build-out needs to fall on the large load cost causers. It can't fall on existing residential and commercial customers. And number two, we all have to figure out how to get new supply online. That means siting, permitting, financing, figuring out the supply chain issues, the interconnection issues. And by the way, it means getting out of the way of clean energy projects as well. I think we've seen the federal government in particular throw up some barriers there, and that's causing a lot of uncertainty as well. So making sure we get out of the way of solar, storage, wind, at the same time as we build all sorts of new energy generation to meet demand.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that was a great conversation to kick us off. I'd like to thank the panel for their thoughts and insights today. Let's give them a round of applause. Thank you.
And thank you, Reed, for wearing green.
Oh yes, I had to wear green for St. Patrick's Day. With that, we mentioned FERC a few times and the important role they're going to play this year and how it's a big year for FERC. So with that, it's my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, David Rosner, Commissioner at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, to the stage for some keynote remarks. David joined FERC as a commissioner in June 2024. He served as chairman from August 13th, 2025 until October 23rd, 2025. He has nearly 2 decades of experience across the gamut of energy technologies, market design, and energy policy issues, both in and outside of government. Prior to his service as a commissioner, he was an energy industry analyst for FERC and spent 2 years on detail at the U.S. State Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee staff. He was also previously a senior policy advisor for the U.S. Department of Energy's Office of Energy Policy and Systems Analysis. So really not only an industry expert, but somebody who has really been at the forefront of these issues and has shown great leadership in his role as chairman and commissioner of FERC. So with that, David, I'd like to welcome you to the stage for some keynote remarks. Thank you.
Well, good. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Is it something? Oh, there we go. All right. Good morning. Reed, thank you very much for the introduction, and hello everyone. It's an honor to be with the Atlantic Council today. I'm Dave Rosner with FERC, and I don't usually give speeches. I usually chat, and so let's pretend that we're doing that right now. So just to make sure everybody knows about FERC, FERC is an agency. It's been around about 40 years. It's bipartisan. We have 5 commissioners, no more than 3 from one party. Right now, we have a full deck, and we're being chaired by Chairman Laura Sweat. We have jurisdiction over electricity and interstate commerce, natural gas, certain rates associated with oil pipelines, and we do permits for things like natural gas pipelines, LNG export facilities, hydropower facilities, and in a backstop role, transmission. We also do a number of other things, but if I missed your special issue, come grab me after. But want to get on to transmission. So my general approach as one of the 5 commissioners at FERC is wherever we can to find consensus. The reason I think Congress created FERC is because the issues that are in front of the Commission on electric rates, on how to get things built, they're complex, they're multifaceted, they're hard to resolve. And so their best idea was, let's put 5 ideally smart people over at FERC. Let's have them build records. Let's have them do the boring but very important adjudicatory work that commissions do. And so that's what we've been up to. In the last 18 months, we've had a really great run of almost all of our orders have been bipartisan and unanimous. And that is so important for unlocking investment. Because when FERC orders become partisan, when they have legal defects or are too far in any one particular direction, we have a review by a court, and the order can come back and the decision can be vacated. And that's been a real challenge over the last decade, where we've been going in a lot of different directions, all of them well-intentioned. But my view, perhaps more compromise rather than less would have been useful for getting more done in this country. And so it's been a real delight over the last year and a half to work with the colleagues, Republican, Democrat. We don't really talk about it that way that much. We just have these very different backgrounds. I mean, my background is, I worked in an NGO, then I worked for Secretary Moniz in the Obama administration, then I worked for Senator Manchin, and then worked at FERC for a little while, and now I'm back at FERC, and I've got a colleague, Commissioner Chang. She's been a consultant deep into the bowels of rate design for her whole career, steeped in sort of the economic analysis of these things. Chairman Sweat, she's a pipeline lawyer, and Commissioner Lissert, he has a background in energy project safety. And Commissioner C, she worked for the state of West Virginia as their solicitor. And so we have all these different perspectives. We have a wonderful staff, and I'm really proud of the work that we've been doing. And I don't think it's just the people. I think this room, you've touched on some of these themes that we've been talking about for years. I think someone said since Austin, and perhaps even before that. We have a lot of new demand in this country. it's a staggering amount of demand. It's something like adding a Texas and a California in 4 years from now to the grid. That's a lot of electricity. That's a lot of energy. And my view is that imperative to meet the moment, which is so important for the country in so many different ways, really makes it easier, I think, to make hard decisions. And so that's what we've been trying to do. And so I'll bucket my remarks into 3 categories. First, we got to build some things. Second, we got to modernize. And third, we got to make sure that we have good data to make the best decisions we can, because all of our decisions today are going to be made under uncertainty. And so let's try the best we can. So on the building, I think there's broad, bipartisan, nonpartisan. Ask anybody on the street. Somebody said it takes 8 years for the average project to go through the PJM. That's the grid operator in this part of the country to go through from application to actually steel in the ground and construction complete. That's way too slow. I can give you countless examples. I mean, last month we approved the Goldendale Pump Storage Project. That's a hydropower pump storage project in Washington State. From application to permit, not even construction, it took 7 years. 2 years at FERC to do the environmental review, 3 years to do the Clean Water Act, 6 years to do the National Historic Preservation consultation, which was never even completed. 7 years to do the permit, not even built. That is way too slow. There's too many transmission lines that if they were people, they could vote. And any given power plant, I mean, we've got incredibly high prices. My view is the fastest way to get those bills lower is all of the above. We should look at all the different aspects of what's going into that bill, but especially the biggest part of that bill that we can lower is by adding some new supply and getting prices down. And so very focused on the FERC tools to get things built. On the electric power side of the coin, they're fairly limited. What we have control over in places where there are markets, we do the prices. And we've worked very hard over the last decade, been in a lot of different directions, and where we are now, we have this compromise where the markets value each electron and the energy source that they come from based on something called capacity accreditation, which is the actual contribution of that resource to reliability. It sounds boring. It's really exciting to me, but it's not where we've been in the history of valuing electrons. And those markets they're sending a signal for investment. And it's really useful, I think, for our state partners who are doing RFPs or who want to see certain things built in their state to know with certainty, here's what this energy source can get paid from the market. And what it does is, for something like a battery or a dispatchable natural gas or nuclear power plant, they're worth a lot, because what we need are things that we can count on peak days, peak hours. And things like solar PV, that's worth a lot less right now unless you pair it with a battery. So solar PV has gone down, the value of it's gone down by about half in these markets where we have accreditation. Because every time you add some more solar PV, we kind of have a good idea of when the sun's going to shine and when it won't. And so we know that the incremental value of a megawatt of solar, it goes down because it's correlated with other solar and it's correlated with weather. That doesn't mean that it's not very important. The electrons that come off of solar are cheap, but we need this whole grid to work together, and that's what capacity accreditation does. And so we can take those signals and then know where to invest. So that's one part of it. We also, where there's infrastructure needed, we can do the permits for natural gas pipelines. And we've been doing that. We've been, again, as a country, in a lot of different directions on this for a lot of different reasons. But where we are right now is we've had some Supreme Court cases that have sort of narrowed the scope of some of our environmental review. Where we're considering things, we're considering the direct impacts of the projects, we're making sure that we're analyzing all the affected communities, which is very important work. I think FERC does a world-class job. We are actually, of all the agencies that do environmental impact statements, FERC is the fastest. It takes about 2 years. We're doing a little better than that recently. Many projects don't require that level of review, and we're even faster at that. But it still takes time. But we're doing well with that. but not every region needs pipelines. Some regions need transmission lines. And on that side of the coin, we've been active on planning because FERC does not issue permits for transmission lines except in a backstop case. But what we do is we oversee regional planning. And so on the regional planning, when I got to FERC, there was a rule that had been in the works for about 4 years. It's called Order Number 1920. And the Order Number 1920 thesis is simple. It says, let's look out 20 years into the future. Let's figure out where new demand's going to be and where the likely sources of new generation are going to be. And let's plan that thinking about reliability benefits and the economic benefits, which that economic in this context in FERC speak is code for if we're reducing congestion that's expensive on the grid, that's a savings and we should count that. And a few other things, but that's the general thesis. It was locked up in a partisan vote. But when I got to FERC and I worked with then Chairman Christie and then Commissioner Chang, who's still there, we worked to get that rule bipartisan. And here's what we did. My view is that part of the problem with transmission permit certainty is that states are the ones that pay for these projects. Their ratepayers pay. Regular mom and pop, small businesses, people in their homes pay for these projects. They were very frustrated with FERC because they didn't feel like they had a lot of say in how the projects were planned and how they decided among states in a region how to pay for them. And so what we did in that rule is we said, all right, states, you come to the table, you pick the scenarios that you run, you get to have input on all the modeling, sounds really fun to me, and you all go and agree among yourselves on how you'd like to spread the cost of these projects among your region, among yourselves, and then let us know what it is. That was the evolution. It's been sort of controversial, but more recently less so, because we've been making great progress. I check in on our states, and my understanding is many of them are very close to unanimous or near unanimous agreement on how they want to spread the cost of those projects. And why that's important is when you go and get a permit for a transmission line, the state commissions issue those permits. And if the state commission doesn't think that that project is needed, and the state commission doesn't think that they're being allocated the cost fairly, they're not going to want to give the permit for that project, and that's just going to slow it down. So this is better data, better decisions, empower our state commissions to have a skin in the game and have input at the table from the beginning. That's the change we made. I don't know why that was so hard, but we got there, and I'm very excited about it. Now, we also have been working with NERC to look at interregional transmission. This is transmission that crosses like the Mid-Atlantic into the Midwest and beyond. Those projects, they're very rare, and and those that do exist tend to be done on a merchant basis. They're not planned. They're done based on a private entity saying, hey, I think this project, I might get some off-takers, I might be able to make a deal here. NERC, which is the entity that's responsible for liability under our statute, did a study that was released last year, and their study said, we see a major gap in the United States. We think we need about 35 gigawatts of additional interregional transfer capability. And that will make the U.S. more reliable. Other folks have picked up that report and said, what does this mean not just for reliability, but for things like congestion relief and getting access to lower cost generation and just having a more efficient dispatch of the system? And the value of meeting that mandate is billions of dollars. And so we are not at a place right now where we've picked up that rule. I would love to, and I know there's also conversation in Congress about how to do that. Regional planning, I will say, is difficult. Interregional planning is probably an order of magnitude greater skills challenge. But in my book, if NERC tells you we have a reliability gap, we got to figure out how to close that. Transmission, standards, whatever we need to do, I think we need to keep working on it. Another point, so on the modernize topic, I know there's been some folks who addressed this earlier, but again, while we're building things, which takes a long time to do, I also think there's a huge opportunity, and this is broadly understood. I think there's great consensus on that we need to make the most of the infrastructure that we have today. And so these are called grid enhancing technologies, line ratings, ambient adjusted, dynamic, we could talk for hours just about this, but all these things have this basic premise, which is, hey, we have this huge infrastructure. The largest machine in the country is the grid. Many hours of the day, it's not utilized a lot. And so how do we get full use of this asset that's incredibly valuable? One of the places where the commission has acted, in 2021, we issued order number 881 for the FERC geeks in the audience. It's called the Ambient Adjusted Line Ratings Rule. What that rule said was, when the temperature changes, the amount of power you can move on a transmission line changes. Let's make sure that all the utilities that are FERC jurisdictional are adjusting the line ratings for temperature so that we can maximize throughput. And also, by the way, it has a reliability implication too, because if we're not tracking temperature and we have too much power on a line when it's really hot, that's not a safe operating condition. That rule started as a draft in 2020. We just had the first RTO comply fully and not comply, but implement today, or not today, just a week or two ago was PJM. They were the first. We have others coming later this year, and we have some others that are waiting till 2028. My take is it's great that PJM complied. Also, they should take a look at the other suite of line rating technologies, which can all be implemented just with software in some cases. You can also use hardware, which has additional benefits, but there's a software approach that they literally could go and do now, particularly for certain lines that have congestion or that are important for either reliability or serving some new loads. And what I mean by dynamic line ratings, I mean when the wind blows, it can cool the line off and you can move more power. And when the sun shines, that can heat or cool the line. Those are other ways to adjust the line ratings. And I would love to see industry just take that and run with it. We have a lot of folks, in the industry recognizing that this is possible. I think we need to just have the regions come together and do it. Part of my view broadly is FERC regulation. I've told you some of these timelines. Ambient adjusted line rating, draft rule 2020, implementation 2026. FERC's transmission rule, order number 1920, started working on that in 2020. We're not even at compliance yet. Interconnection queues, I know somebody talked about that earlier. We have a rule to move those faster by adopting best practices from across the industry. Nothing radical, just simple things like maybe take a deposit to make sure that the projects are real, and also instead of studying them one at a time, study them in a cluster. That started again, 2020. We are just now nearing implementation of that. And so, I love working on FERC rules. We do need to do that sometimes, but also to meet the moment, we need industry to say, you know what, we're just going to bring some of these things to FERC without FERC telling us, because that would be much faster. And I'm on the Q side of the coin. Another way to get more out of this grid is we have all these interconnection processes. They take way too long. The pro forma FERC interconnection rule said 455 days from start to finish to do the studies before you even build the project. There's been some breakthroughs on using automation and AI to do that work faster. In MISO and SPP, they've adopted some software. It's actually, in those cases, it's from a company in Pennsylvania, and they've taken the study time down from years to days with no regulation. They just did it. And that's the kind of entrepreneurial spirit that I think more utilities and the RTOs need to adopt. That's how we're going to solve this price problem. That's how we're going to solve the demand problem. It's by doing these things faster. And it doesn't mean doing them with less precision, because the reason we have these studies is to make sure that the power plant is not going to create a reliability problem. And so we need to safely study it, but it doesn't have to take forever. So that's a part of it. I also want to just touch on, I'll be very high level because some of the FERC proceedings are subject to rules that preclude me from talking about it with anyone except in writing. But at a high level, FERC has acted on co-location. And what I mean by that is we've made it legal in one part of the country. And the way that we've done that is that we've created new transmission services for the first time in a generation that allow flexibility. And so those services allow flexibility for people to be completely on the grid to completely off the grid and everything in between. And we've also created services where when you want to build the infrastructure to be fully on the grid, that you can give people access to the grid right now with whatever they can take. And again, there's been a fascinating entrepreneurial development in that space where there are companies that with certainty can characterize exactly how many electrons you can take out of the grid and put it in the interconnection agreement for a new load that says, we need you to be offline for 37 hours a year. And then they can move forward now with no new build. They can lower the rates because numerator stays the same, denominator gets bigger, that's how you lower rates. And they also can pay for new infrastructure to get fully deliverable, so you don't have to curtail. So that's where we've been thinking. Just want to touch on a couple other things on better data. I've been very adamant that we need better information on these large loads, and it's not rocket science. We regulate RTOs. The RTOs, I've written them a letter saying, you should just take a deposit. We spent 5 years figuring out how do we get speculators out of the interconnection queue. The same thing is true for demand. We can get certainty on demand very quickly, and that's going to enable us to make decisions on building transmission and building new generation to support it. And it's not just an idea. I met actually with the Salt River project, not even FERC jurisdictional. They said, hey, we changed our rules. We're about an 8,000 megawatt system. We had 8,000 megawatts of new load interconnection requests, which is like 100% growth, which is wild. They're pretty small. They're out near Phoenix. And they said, we changed our rules to take a bigger deposit. We took $250 or so million deposits. The number of requests went down from 8,000 to less than around 900, and they went down from 23 to 3, and we have certainty to build. And so this isn't that hard. We can take deposits. We can count the load. We don't need to do, endless, comparison of NDAs around the country. If you take the deposit, that's a good way to know that someone's actually going to show up. And by the way, we've been working very closely with our state partners. We just had a meeting on the coattails of NARUC. Some of our states said, hey, we might need a little more transparency on the FERC costs. But by the way, did you know that 20 states have large load tariffs in place and 9 are in flight to develop those tariffs? And those tariffs all do things like, let's make sure that the large loads pay for the grid that they're using. And there's a lot of progress that's been made here. Even in the last 6 months, the rate of change has been really fast. And so I don't know that those 20 state tariffs plus the 9 that are in flight, I don't know if the world has caught up to those yet, because, I think we can understand why. First of all, why do we call them tariffs? They're just rates that they charge, but it's kind of complicated. But I really think we have a good story to tell about doing this growth, doing it smarter, and making sure the right people pay for it. It again is not that complicated, or rather, it is complicated, but we have the tools to do it. This is what our state commissions have decades of experience with, and we need to do it, and then we need our industry partners to explain it, and I'm going to try and do that too. So I think I've gone on for probably more time than you gave me. Yep, I'm getting a thumbs up. So that's my little speech. I'd love to hear questions, catch up with folks after this if you're around. So thank you very much, Atlanta Council.
All right, thank you, Commissioner Rosner, for that. Those were expansive and sweeping remarks, but I think you really dove into the richness of what this issue set provides and offers. We're going to move on to our second panel now, so I'll invite those panelists up to the stage, but first I'll introduce our moderator for the next session, David Yellen, Director of Climate Policy Innovation at the Clean Air Task Force, but in my opinion, more importantly, a non-resident senior fellow here at the Atlantic Council's Global Energy Center. So welcome to the stage, guys.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you, Reed, for the introduction. We've heard a lot about planning so far, so I'm excited to be hosting this and moderating this conversation on planning innovation, market design innovation, to meet some of the challenges we heard in the first panel and from Commissioner Rosner. I'm joined from this excellent panel to my left, John Miller, Director of Policy for Transmission at the Clean Energy Buyers Association, Raquel Pichardo, co-founder and managing partner at the Groundwire Group, and Zach Zimmerman, Director of Research and Policy at Grid Strategies, LLC. I'm going to jump right in, and I'll remind everybody before we start, I'd love to hear your questions. We'll probably have time for 1 to 2 towards the back end of this panel. So in the audience here, please think and raise your hands in a little while. For everybody online and in the audience, if you prefer, you can also go to askac.org and submit your questions there. John, I want to turn to you first. We heard a lot about cost allocation on the first panel, but I think we're talking about transmission today, and in particular how we meet rising demand from data centers and also other sources, while also trying to advance and retain affordability and reliability of the grid. As those new transmission lines are coming on, how are those prices being factored into retail rates? And on the planning side, who's making those decisions, and what are some of the key factors they're considering when they decide which transmission lines to build, which to upgrade, et cetera?
A lot to unpack there. Happy to do that. So first, maybe I'll table set really quick just to explain the perspective I'm bringing to the table here. So as you mentioned, I'm with CEBA. We are a business association that represents 1/5 of the Fortune 500. Our members collectively represent something like $38 trillion in market capitalization. We're across every sector of the economy. So when we talk about transmission, we're bringing to that conversation a perspective that we, A, need more of it to power the operations of our member companies, but B, we need to be doing that cost effectively, and that's a theme that we've heard both in the first panel, but also from Commissioner Rosner's remarks. And so how do we approach that? And actually, maybe I'll put a pin in that because I know you asked about retail rates, and then I'll come back to how do we actually approach the the transmission cost piece. So I think Christina Hayes did a really great job unpacking the different pieces of what comprises a retail bill. And I think that the highlights to make there are, first of all, that retail rates ultimately are the jurisdiction of the states. And so how the costs from a wholesale perspective and from a transmission perspective flow into rates, that's entirely in the state's realm. So there's a lot in terms that you can do in terms of retail rate making to ensure that costs are allocated to retail ratepayers based on the cost causation beneficiary pays principles. But from a wholesale perspective and a FERC perspective on transmission rates, first of all, the same principle applies in terms of we want to hew to the longstanding principle of beneficiary pays. But second of all, I think there's a lot that we can do in terms of actually bringing down the total cost of the transmission investment pie that we collectively are making in the industry. And that's a space where CEBA has been very active in our advocacy, and it touches on what Commissioner Rosner mentioned around Order 1920, which is that historically we have seen a utility industry that has skewed its investment in transmission towards local reliability projects. Brattle did a study in 2023 that found something like $25 billion of transmission was being planned for that year, 90% of which was being spent on these local reliability projects. And that's a missed opportunity to plan the most cost optimal transmission system that we can get. It leads to siloed outcomes. It's kind of akin to building the interstate transmission system the interstate highway system without states actually coordinating as to where the lines are going to meet up at state boundaries. It's kind of it's like I said, a missed opportunity. So that brings us to Order 1920, and I think why it's so critical for landing the plane on at least strong regional planning outcomes is that it is taking a much longer planning horizon than most utilities are currently doing under current planning processes. We're looking at a 20-year horizon. We are looking at scenario-based planning so that we're trying to mitigate the risk of what happens if we get the load forecast wrong. What happens if we get the forecast wrong on what types of generation are going to be using the system down the line. And then on top of that, we are accounting for a multitude of benefits, far more benefits than currently are accounted for with current transmission planning. And that's important because we know that there are a host of benefits right now that we're effectively leaving value on the table. And accordingly, it also leads to a bit of a free rider problem where because we aren't accounting for the benefits, we aren't allocating costs in a way that actually is commensurate with how those benefits flow. So Order 1920 is really meant to take this comprehensive approach and really do a much better job of getting robust transmission planning in place. Now, where that brings us to today is the compliance process, I think, is so critical because FERC has already promulgated the rule. Now all the different planning regions are working to comply. And as Commissioner Rosner mentioned, a critical piece of that is cost allocation because that ties into having states have a meaningful seat at the table also is much more likely to help streamline on the back end the permitting process for these transmission assets. It does us no good if we have a really robust transmission plan, but then we can't actually get states to approve these transmission lines that are in the plan. And that's, we've seen evidence of that in certain pockets of the country where, for various reasons, transmission projects that are picked up in regional plans don't get built because they hit a brick wall in state processes. So I think that, getting the cost allocation right and getting something that the states are comfortable with will be a critical piece of actually getting these good, robust regional transmission plans in place.
Thanks, John. I want to pick up and welcome the rest of the panel into this conversation as well on, how, again, we've had these challenges for a long time. I think now we're in this moment with data center build out. It's the hot topic. There are obviously huge challenges that come with that, and we've seen that and had that discussion earlier as well. I'm curious, what opportunities that presents in terms of being able to meet this moment. What are some of the planning frameworks or regulatory or market approaches that you're either seeing or could recommend to help some operators and planners sort of meet this moment? Are there any solutions, any examples of success in the short term before 1920 is sort of fully promulgated that you would point to?
I can jump in here. John really did a good job of setting up where planning is at right now and where it could go with Order 1920 at Grid Strategies. So I guess I should introduce myself. I'm Zach Zimmerman. I'm at Grid Strategies. We're a transmission bulk power sector consulting firm. One of the things we do is we work with trade associations for advanced transmission technologies like grid enhancing technologies or high performance conductors. So I think we see that as a really good complement to the long-term planning that we need. We've done studies that show over the next 5 years, utilities have forecasted about the equivalent of 15 New York cities being added to the grid in the next 5 years. It's a significant amount of load growth, and the long-term planning in 1920 needs to be happening to accommodate some of that. But alongside that, we have some near-term opportunities with these advanced transmission technologies, which can come online in less than 3 years. Some can be added within months. So that represents a very quick way to optimize and kind of maximize the existing infrastructure that we have. In terms of planning frameworks, we kind of talk about this through what we call like transmission loading framework, where you optimize the existing grid using kind of the lowest cost, fastest options. Then you reinforce the existing grid. You do things like reconductor with high performance conductors. And lastly, you expand the grid. And you do that by adding new transmission lines through processes like Order 1920. So that's a planning process that could be adopted. There's not really that near-term planning that takes place really in that 3-year period, particularly for anything beyond reliability. So that's one option.
Yeah,
wanted to add, so I'm Raquel Pichardo. I am co-founder of the Groundwire Group. We do strategy and communications consulting across renewables and transmissions, sustainable finance, and nature-based solutions. So a lot of our work on the renewables and transmission side is working with the advocacy community on how to get projects online, how to equip states to talk to communities about some of these plans. And I think one of the things that when we're thinking about planning and when we're thinking about kind of getting these projects built and the permitting process, something that often gets missed, I think, in that planning process is the cost of community pushback. So the Clean Air Task Force has published a stat that shows that 1/3 of transmission projects in the US are actually either delayed or canceled because of community opposition, right? And why does this happen? I mean, we've been hearing over and over throughout these panels that our grid is old, it's aging. This idea that we have to invest money in the grid in order for it to be more affordable and reliable in the long term is bumping up against just the current moment that we're in, where everybody, 76% of Americans say that we're in a cost of living crisis. People are concerned. They hear the message that the reason we're investing in transmission is for renewables or for data centers, and they don't hear the message that it's for them, right? And so that's a real problem that has to be addressed, can be addressed in the planning process by having more collaborative planning frameworks in place. One conversation that we've been having with advocates is kind of reviving this idea of planned energy zones or energy corridors. It's a state-driven process where you can do research to say, okay, these are the areas where we can potentially plan transmission, and you can bring the community into that process early to get their input and try to deconflict areas before projects try to get built. So that provides an opportunity not only for the community to provide input, but also for there to be transparency around what are the likelihoods of projects actually getting built and how that gets then factored into bills and pricing, so.
Fantastic.
Can I actually?
Yes, please.
Raquel opened the door on affordability, and I did want to bring in another layer to that, which I think no question that we have to be very cognizant of the affordability pressures that residential and business consumers are facing. I think that we also though have to, as an industry and policymakers, have to have an honest conversation, be very transparent that we do have to, these are generational investments that we have to make, and so it's not necessarily about bringing down your bill, at least the transmission portion of your bills today. It's about optimizing what that transmission spend would look like if we don't make these changes to how transmission's planned for right now.
Yep.
Thanks, John, and thanks, Raquel, also for referencing a CATF report. I really want to dive more into this, how we communicate some of those long-term benefits, because I think that's a real challenge. Yeah. First, I do want to turn back to Zach briefly on some of the. I mean, we've heard part of the issue here is how ad hoc a lot of these choices are, these investment choices, project decisions, and we've talked about the need to get longer-term planning, and that's part of what Order 1920 is in pursuit of. So I'm curious to hear from you about, one, how we can be more effective at some of that prediction, given the uncertainty we've seen in the market in the past few years. And also, sorry for a two-part question here, Commissioner Rosner mentioned the importance and opportunities with interregional planning as well, and I'd just love to hear your perspective on some of the benefits there and opportunities that present themselves going forward.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I probably will start with the interregional piece first. In terms of most ad hoc processes that we have, for planning, interregional is definitely the most ad hoc in the country. We really actually don't have interregional planning. It's just coordination is what I would call it. And as Commissioner Rosner teed up nicely, interregional planning is connecting, building transmission lines between kind of disparate regions to take advantage of different generation profiles, but also different peak load profiles. So Commissioner Rosner also talked about kind of the declining value of solar, capacity value of solar as you add more to the grid. Building more interregional transmission allows you to move that solar from where it may be saturated to areas where there may be additional demand for it. Alongside that, you also have extreme weather concerns to think about. So while there may be declining capacity value solar, other generation resources have these correlated outage risks during extreme weather events. So as an example, during Winter Storm Fern, we actually saw a underperformance by both gas and coal compared to what they were accredited to provide during extreme weather events. So my colleague Michael Goggin is testifying before the House today on that issue as well. But all this to say is when you have those correlated outages, particularly on the gas system, this leads to spikes in prices. And in Winter Storm Fern, we saw prices actually spike between 60 and 90x normal natural gas prices. So it's a huge issue in terms of affordability, and building interregional lines helps to mitigate some of those reliability considerations and provides that economic value. Commissioner Rosner talked about NERC conducting their interregional transfer capability study, and they identified 35 gigawatts of new interregional transmission that's needed. We did a follow-on study that showed about those lines, that additional capacity would deliver between $7 and $10 billion in benefits annually, and those lines would pay for themselves within 3 years. So these are incredibly beneficial infrastructure projects that we should be prioritizing. Unfortunately, we don't have those planning processes in place. There are proposals like in the Manchin and Barrasso bill that was negotiated last Congress around adding interregional planning requiring FERC to conduct a rulemaking around interregional planning. There's also nearer term opportunities that we could take. Regions could do a better job of giving credit to these interregional transmission lines for that capacity that they're delivering, particularly during extreme weather events. So there's a lot more we could be doing on interregional transmission to provide both reliability and economic benefits. On the planning front, I can point to one, actually probably one of the best planning practices that's going on, and it's actually for interregional planning in the West. They have this consortium called West Tech, which has brought together all the states in the Western interconnection, along with utilities and many other stakeholders. And they put together both a 10-year plan, and we'll be putting together a 20-year plan looking at West-wide needs for interregional transmission. They identified $60 billion worth of projects and almost 12,000 miles of upgrades associated with that. So they're doing what John was talking about in terms of a 20-year plan, scenario-based, quantifying benefits for those projects. All those things are needed in our planning. And you know, down the line, we're still doing a lot of deterministic planning, and I do think one of the innovations we need is to do more probabilistic work as well.
Great. Thanks, Secretary. Go ahead, John.
Yeah, add one more example just on interregional planning. So I used to work at a developer, so my former colleagues may throw tomatoes at me for saying this, but I think one other really interesting example has been what MISO and SPP have been up to. They undertook this effort to, they were observing that there are all these generators that are looking to interconnect along the seams of the two RTOs, and those projects kept leaving the queue because they were triggering these massive project-killing network upgrades. And so the two RTOs came together and said, what can we do about that? And they developed this portfolio called the Joint Targeted Interconnection Queue Portfolio, which is really meant to solve this pain point that was just preventing a large volume of new generation from coming onto both systems. Now, developers quibble about how the cost allocation worked out, so let's park that to the side. But the planning itself was a really novel approach, and I think highlights what can come of enhanced coordination, even absent a mandate for interregional planning.
Yeah, and it was a great planning effort to connect more generation. The issue is it was a one-time effort, and there was not cost allocation associated with it. They had to go. MISO and SPP had to develop a unique cost allocation method, and they haven't repeated that study process. So while it is a really good step forward, this needs to be something that becomes a more routine process.
Absolutely. As promised, with a few minutes left, Raquel, I want to turn back to you. As you mentioned and teed up, community opposition has become one of the really pressing topics and barriers and speed limits for infrastructure deployment across North America. Often very reasonable community opposition. And I'm curious to hear from you. I mean, we mentioned this issue of long-term benefits versus the short-term ratepayer costs and how it's hard to really express and quantify. how resilience investments, grid upgrades actually benefit ratepayers in the long term. I'm curious to hear from you of any examples you've seen, one of effective frameworks for doing that, but also just more broadly, projects or investments where the communities really have been involved from the outset, and that's led to better outcomes than we've seen elsewhere.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, this is such a vital issue. I think, again, like I like to put on my communications hat also when we're talking about these things, and we always talk about transmission in terms of, we try to decouple it from the renewables conversation occasionally when it makes sense, and tie it more to, you wouldn't leave bridges to rust, you wouldn't leave potholes on your road. You invest in fixing those, and that's the same thing. That's what we're doing with transmission. It's critical infrastructure. Going back to this idea of kind of preferred energy zones, I mean, part of the reason why that's appealing and why it's gaining traction again, I mean, it's something that has been done for years. Texas famously did this in the 2000s to build a corridor to bring wind energy from the west over to the east, is that it is, one of the benefits is that it's an opportunity for the community to to provide input into where these zones are sited and where they go. So that's one thing. When it comes to transmission build out, like other types of energy projects, you want to involve the community early, you want to engage them early and often. This is a huge challenge for transmission projects because they go across many communities, across many jurisdictions, and when it comes to community engagements and community benefits, each community is going to be unique. I think back to the example that Christina gave earlier today where there was a big, kind of corridor going through a community that it wasn't even serving that community, right? So how was that particular community benefiting from it? If they weren't, you get comments like, I hate this thing. And in some cases, we're gonna stop this thing, right? When you're thinking about benefits to the community, you can think about it both monetarily and non-monetarily, right? And there's many examples that we can pull from. There have been a lot of studies done, studies done recently to look at this because it has become such an issue. So CATF had a report out, the Northeast Grid Planning Forum, ASEG, have put out reports with really good examples of how communities have worked to try to benefit from transmission build outs. And it can take various forms, so it can go anywhere from they just get a simple monetary benefit, maybe a one-time, to ongoing benefits, to them actually having an ownership stake in it. So I like to think, I think a really interesting example is I have the name here, the Northern Plains Connector, where they actually are working with community groups that are then distributing, they provide assets, monetary money, to these community groups that then provide grants to the local community. But it's not the developer themselves saying, okay, I'm gonna give this to this community member and this to this community member. It's actually a community-driven decision about how and who benefits from this project. And I think that's really interesting. We are starting to see more of this co-ownership idea as well, right? So moving from, okay, we're just going to receive maybe a one-time or ongoing monetary benefit to, no, we actually want a stake in this project. And you see this a lot in Canada, where you have the First Nations communities actually taking significant stakes, 40, 50% stakes in large transmission projects, where they can continually benefit from those projects. And you're starting to see that a little bit more in the US as well. There's the West of Devers project in California that is also owned, has a portion of tribal ownership associated with that as well. So, we always like to say there's no transition without transmission, right? And there's no transmission, honestly, without community buy-in. And it's not an easy thing, but it needs to get done.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so much of the conversation is focused on the costs and the challenges associated. And I think, one, innovative approaches to actually ensuring communities benefit from these projects and investments, but also two, just how we communicate and talk about these projects and the roles they can play and the growth they can enable in a lot of these communities, I think.
Yeah, and I think for the industry to understand that bringing the community in is not always a cost. You know, this isn't a muscle that this industry has had to flex in a very long time because we haven't built anything for decades, right? But this is really a way to de-risk projects, to bring costs down, and ensure that communities benefit. So it really can be a win-win. I think it's a mistake. Oftentimes people think of it as a cost, and I think that's a mistake.
Zach, did you want to jump in?
I was just going to jump in on the communication piece and say, particularly for grid operators and utilities, John made the point that most of our transmission today is planned for reliability. And when you plan transmission for reliability needs, you often don't quantify the benefits. And so that is an area where if grid operators and utilities spent a little bit more time quantifying the benefits, some of which were laid out in Order 1920, and being more transparent and providing those up front, that is a tool to both help the utilities, but also local communities understand what they're actually receiving from this transmission line beyond just like the steel in the ground that's running through their community.
Right. Absolutely. Are there any very quick questions in the room? Sure, right here.
Yeah, John, at the start of the panel, you referenced the fact that a huge... Thank you so much. John, at the start of the panel, you referenced how a huge percentage with the broader group reporting up to even 90% of transmission projects are concentrated locally and that we're potentially missing out on benefits there. What incentives are pushing transmission planners to focus so much of that construction on local projects?
Yeah, so yeah, there are a couple reasons. I think the largest reason is a byproduct of how the current planning rules under FERC's Order 1000 work. You know, I think there's pretty clear evidence that, so forgive me as I go down a short rabbit hole here, that FERC's Order 1000 requires competition in regional transmission planning. But there's a carve out for what are essentially this local bucket of immediate need reliability projects. And so what we see is that, you know, utilities, they want to continue, you know, they have they need to deliver for their shareholders, especially investor-owned utilities, and so that leads them to, you know, find ways to end run competition. That's the primary reason. I think there are certainly other reasons, and that's, you know, I think one of the innovations, just to tie this back to Order 1920 and like what it's changing slightly, is that it's acknowledging this potentially perverse incentive that exists under the status quo rules, and it's telling utilities that if they're going to undertake, you know, what is considered an asset management or end-of-life replacement, look ahead and figure out, is there an opportunity to right-size that project, meaning to basically to add more capacity, to overbuild the line that you would otherwise just do a wreck and replace. And that creates an opportunity, if they're right-sizing, to then not be subject to competition. And so that's a really interesting incentive potentially for utilities to start leaning in the direction of thinking more proactively about system needs as opposed to just the traditional do loop of asset replacement projects.
Fantastic. I think we're basically out of time. I'm blessed to not be able to see the timer from where I'm sitting. So I'm gonna ask just for a very quick lightning round, similar to the first panel. A year from now, what does success look like in the transmission space? Obviously, probably could go on for a very long time, but I'll ask you to keep it very brief and move down the line from John.
So for me, I think success means that all of the transmission planning regions have filed their Order 1920 compliance plans, and that they are, you know, a good compliance plan, and that FERC acts quickly on those compliance plans because we can't wait any longer.
Okay.
I have to put on my communications hat. So success would be if people really understood, if the general public understood the need for transmission build out and supported it.
Fantastic. Zach.
Well, I would echo both what John and Raquel said. I think both of those things are critical, particularly Order 1920. I will add that for many of these ad hoc interregional processes that we're kind of seeing, I would like to see some more hooks developed for those processes in terms of cost allocation or pathways for some of these projects to be constructed.
Fantastic. Thank you so much to our panel for joining us here today. I think your insights have been super useful. Thank you also to Frank Willie and the whole events team here at the Atlanta Council for putting this together. I'll now hand it off to Landon Darrence, the Senior Director of the Global Energy Center here at the Atlanta Council. Thank you again.
All right, well, welcome, Landon Darrence. I'm the Vice President for Energy and Infrastructure at the Atlanta Council, and in that capacity, I also am the Senior Director of the Global Energy Center here. Excited to have a really interesting conversation with Ian Magruder, who's the founder and Executive Director of Utilize Coalition, an industry-led nonprofit working to unlock underused capacity. So not just building transmission, but using unlocked, underused capacity on the grid today to lower energy costs and enable faster deployment of advanced technologies. I think we'll dig into what that means. I knew this conversation was going to be good from the start because we're both Californians, and then we learned that we both married women from Texas, and so we have a lot of commonality.
Specifically Houston.
Specifically Houston. But more important than that, I think Ian comes with a rich history and background. He launched the coalition to bring together leading energy consumers, utilities, technology companies, and policymakers after more than 15 years working across the private sector and public policy, including executive roles at startups, Landed, and Organizer. Ian, it's great to have you here. So let's dig into this. You've just stood up the Utilize Coalition. I mean, what is it? What are you aiming to achieve? What's the mission?
Yeah, a week ago today. So Utilize is an industry-led campaign to increase grid utilization, lower electricity costs, and build a faster, more reliable grid. And our goal is to do this both through public communication awareness and policy change. We aim to save Americans billions of dollars by getting more out of the grid we have, and we think that the moment we're in right now as a country with increased load growth and rates increasing really provides an opportunity to focus on this challenge, and a new set of technologies can enable us to unlock it. So excited to talk about that.
You know, we're launching this report today, expanding transmission to achieve low cost, reliable, and abundant energy, right? And the idea here is that we need to build more, but you're saying we also need to utilize and be efficient with what we actually have already in terms of the infrastructure that's existing. What's your theory of change? How do we inspire that level of engagement on these topics?
Yeah, so I think we're going to still need to upgrade the grid, right? We're still going to need to build new generation in this country. That's obvious. I think those things take time. And in the short term, we don't have a lot of time, right? We need to address the capacity, affordability challenges that we have today as a country. And grid utilization is something that we think in the immediate term can unlock a lot of that. And so it's a yes and, not a either or from our perspective. And so our theory of change is, I was sort of touching on this twofold. One, we have to educate people about the challenge. And then two, we think that some simple policy change can really help unlock and prioritize grid utilization. Educating people about the challenge, to me, starts with acknowledging what's causing the price increase of electricity in America. And there's this whole debate raging right now about generation. And you know, on the one side, you have folks saying that wind and solar are the cheapest sources. That's what we have to prioritize. On the other side, you have folks saying, no, we need to build new gas and keep, you know, base load capacity like coal online, and that's what's going to drive affordability. And honestly, that whole debate is a bit of a distraction because the cost of generation has gone down slightly. It's the cost of transmission distribution that is really driving the cost increase in electricity in America. And so it's the poles and wires. And that's where we see a real opportunity, because historically we've always had to build the grid to peak, right? We build the grid for the hottest summer day, the coldest winter night, and it's just how we've had to do it. We haven't had the flexible technologies that we have today that allow us to better manage peak and to build less towards peak and more towards system-wide utilization. And if you can do that, you can put dramatic downward pressure on rates. And I think that's the other thing that's really important for people to understand is that most Americans and even policymakers, I think that any time demand goes up, prices must go up, right? And I think anyone who's taken a high school or college level econ class is taught that when demand goes up in a supply constrained market, prices will go up. And that's the case with most markets, but electricity is a little different, right? Because we have all these fixed costs that we've paid for, if you can sell more electricity over the grid you have, you can actually put downward pressure on the cost of electricity in a pretty meaningful way. And we have some research coming out on Thursday from Brattle that I can share more about that kind of helps quantify that.
But before we go into the report, let's unpack a little bit of what you're saying.
Sure.
I want to start with the temporal element. We don't have time.
Yeah.
What's driving the urgency in your mind to act quickly and swiftly as possible?
Yeah, well, I mean, new load is coming online, right? Data centers are, of course, the big story, but you have new manufacturing, electrification. There's a lot of things driving the need for more electricity in America. And we have to meet that moment as a country. And meanwhile, it's become a political issue now with rates increasing, and governors are talking about this in a way they haven't before. Legislatures are trying to find new solutions. Everyone's sort of slapping the word affordability on their favorite thing. But we think this is one of the few things that can meaningfully reduce the cost of electricity in the short term, because there are lots of things we need to do, some of which take many, many, many years to roll out. But if we can focus on grid utilization, get more out of the grid we've already paid for and built, we think that's somewhere we need to focus.
So I think you're right about the affordability context right now, right? And part of that is the political cycle. We're coming up on midterms. Somebody has to be the villain of the story so that the voters are inspired. But I mean, in real terms, consumers have seen upward pressure in their utility bills. Yeah. Power does feel more expensive. I've been doing this for a long time. I'm used to seeing fuel prices be an issue. Right, this conflict in the Middle East, watching oil, that people are really sensitive to that. Politicians have historically been sensitive to that.
Yeah.
This is new. The power side, it feels a little bit novel in terms of how widely exposed consumers are to it. Why do you think that change is happening? And does it, what's the first step in making sure that education realizes that we can address this in a way where nobody has to be the villain? Like, you have a pretty wide coalition.
Yeah. So you can talk to others about all the different reasons for why electricity costs are increasing in America, and it's probably a longer conversation. LBNL and Brattle did a great study last year on this, and there's a whole variety of factors, everything from the risk of wildfires increasing, supply chain issues. There's a lot of things that are driving the cost of electricity increasing, but the fact is we're in this moment and we have to address it. And so that kind of begs the question why. And I think one question that we're getting is, well, okay, if we have all of this underutilized capacity, and that's another piece that's really important to understand here, is that on any given day, every given hour of any given day, we're really only using about half the total capacity in the grid. So there's a lot of underutilized capacity sitting there waiting to unlock if we can figure out the way to do that. And historically, there are a wide range of solutions that can help with this. We've been talking in some ways about non-wires alternatives for a decade or more in this country, and they haven't been deployed at the scale that I think some people would like. But one, there wasn't the same urgency that we face now, and two, the technology also wasn't quite there. Now we have much more mature technologies that are ready to meet the moment, and the cost of batteries have come down tremendously, and so you have a convergence of both the political and economic forces driving the urgency and the technology being ready that we think makes this a unique moment where we can move the needle.
Does somebody have to shoulder the cost of introducing this technology to the grid, or is it sufficient to find the efficiency gains by this technology being deployed that it offsets that cost?
It more than offsets, and that's the really important part. So the cost benefits are pretty staggering. The Brattle report that we're going to release on Thursday will show that a 10% increase in grid utilization nationwide over the next decade could put between 110 to 170 billion dollars of downward pressure on rates. It'd save Americans that much money. So it's very substantial, and that's why we think states have to start by measuring it, because right now we're not even really measuring this in a meaningful way. There's some other countries that are a little further along, Australia, UK, that have done more work on this, but that's why we're excited about this bill that just passed in Virginia, is it's the first state to move forward in prioritizing and actually measuring grid utilization and incorporating that formally into their grid planning process.
There's two interesting parts of that conversation. One is that you're that focused at a state level, and I do want to talk about that in a second.
Sure.
The other is like you do have a legislative mandate. You're thinking about how you transform at a state and local level, not just in the federal capacity.
Yeah.
But before I switch to that conversation, because that's where I want to go next, just talk to me a little bit more about the technologies that you're really focused on. When we talk about a system-wide approach to better utilizing the capacity on the existing grid, how does that translate to actual investments? You raised batteries earlier. What are the other technology stack that we need to deploy to make this happen?
Great. So I'll start by saying we're a tech-neutral campaign, so we believe strongly that the right approach is to actually measure this and then let the states figure out the right set of technologies to deploy rather than mandating any one specific approach. But having said that, let's talk about some of the ones that I'm excited about that are part of our effort here directly. Google just announced this large data center in Minnesota. Not only are they offsetting all the grid costs, they're including the largest battery ever deployed through Form Energy. They're also putting in another $50 million towards distributed batteries on the grid as good neighbors. And think batteries in church parking lots, right? That can help strengthen the grid in Minnesota. A great example, Tesla has just deployed their millionth Powerwall in the last year. If you can connect all those batteries, tremendous capacity, not to mention the mega packs that you can site along transmission corridors, right? Carrier is putting batteries in all of their heat pumps now. And if you think about the load that's created, the peaks that we talk about on those summer days and winter nights, those are driven largely by HVAC. That's transformative. You have SPAN that has smart panels that can manage dynamically all the appliances in your home or building in real time without you having to think about it, and load shift in real time. Renew Home with their Nest thermostats has gigawatts of capacity ready to unlock by preheating and pre-cooling homes if the right policy's in place, right? Veris is building flexible data centers that are battery enabled. So all of these are examples. That's not even to mention the advanced transmission technologies and grid enhancing technologies that other speakers have mentioned here today. CTC Global with their advanced conductoring, Heindel with dynamic line rating. There's so many companies that have solutions. And I think the important thing to keep in mind here is that these are not unproven new technologies, right? These are things that have been deployed at scale and are ready to scale and collectively could unlock hundreds of gigawatts of capacity if they're brought online. And so let's do that, but let's not mandate someone's favorite tech. Let's empower the states and regulators to come up with the best, lowest cost solutions for their unique grids.
We have a pretty educated community in the audience today on these topics, but let's assume some of the viewers at home maybe aren't as familiar. You put a lot of emphasis on storage, on battery storage in particular there. What's the value add? Why do we need that on the grid today? How is that balancing the system to be able to provide, get us closer to that 10% utility capacity factor?
Yeah. Well, it comes back to the point I made earlier about we've always had to build our grid to peak. We didn't have meaningful storage at scale. And so if you can essentially charge up batteries of all kinds, right? Front of the meter, behind the meter, wherever. When electricity is expensive and in demand, and deploy it when it's in those other hours of the day, it allows you to do exactly what we're talking about here, which is better utilize the grid. So we're going to need more storage capacity in this country, and I think there's lots of opportunity for that, both at the large and small scale.
And the nice part is storage is kind of one of the bipartisan gems of what's going on in Washington, D.C.
Yeah.
And probably at the state level, which is another factor. We're sitting in D.C., but you're not thinking about that necessarily. In fact, you brought up Richmond earlier.
Yeah.
What is the new coalition's interest at the state level? Like, how will you engage in every state? Is there a specific strategy for which states you want to be up in front with?
So we think this approach can work across red, blue, and purple states. This is a very cross-partisan approach, and we've been talking to lawmakers and stakeholders kind of across the political spectrum. Mm-hmm. We're looking primarily initially at the states that have experienced load growth and rate increases, because that's where there's an urgency, right, from a political and economic standpoint. And there are a lot of them. We won't be able to sort of act in every state immediately, but we will have a lobbying presence. We're gonna work with a wide range of stakeholders, everyone from consumer advocates and utilities to environmental groups and right of center groups, to build a really unique coalition to push for this.
You made it clear that you're willing to work in a lot of different states. I will say, when I look at Virginia, the problem set, just south of DC here is Data Center Alley and the build out and the growing NIMBYism. I've never seen data centers impact something like real property markets, and they are now. People are thinking differently about it, both from power prices, but also the infrastructure in their backyard. That's very different than going to Philadelphia and thinking about some of the leadership in Pennsylvania as they see this as an upside swing for using their natural gas, for building out infrastructure in kind of maybe perceived forgotten parts of America.
Yeah.
Will you have a pretty dynamic? Is it intended to be very flexible in how you work with these different capitals?
Yes. I think we'll have a unique coalition in each state. But if you look at the legislation, I think it's actually very transferable. So as an example, this Virginia legislation, which we helped support, many of the companies involved in this effort were helping shape that a bit. It's very straightforward. It's a one-page bill, and it essentially says two things. One, the utilities need to provide grid utilization metrics to the Utility Commission, the regulators. And two, that data, these metrics will be incorporated in the planning process and begin to be prioritized. And we think that's a really important step because it's not happening today.
Why?
Well, we haven't.
What's the gap? Why do we have to mandate at a legislative level that utility grid utilization metrics need to be accounted for? Is this just, do the utilities see this as a burden?
Actually, the utilities are surprisingly open to this that we've been talking to. I think for a few reasons. One, there's a growing recognition that something needs to be done about affordability, right? And the utilities also need to continue upgrading the grid. That needs to happen. But if we don't get better at utilization, we're not going to have the headroom to be able to do that. And I think utilities are a little tired, frankly, of being told they have to do this technology or that technology and sort of mandated. So if there's a North Star that they can work towards, which we think utilization is the right way to prioritize this, and it's done in a tech-neutral way, then they can actually deploy the solutions that make the most sense in their grid. Utilities have a lot of data about which lines have some spare capacity and which lines have higher utilization. And you can put a battery in some of those places and get more out of the grid. And so utilities can be partners in this if we get it right. And they recognize that we're in this dynamic moment and we're going to need to do some things a little differently. And let's do it in a way that, that's sort of a partnership, you could say.
Thinking about doing things differently, we've only talked about AI and data centers as
a causal element of the challenges, right? The new power demand coming from data centers. Do you see the technology focusing also on AI as an enabler to eking out more efficiencies? Are there technologies that'll be AI enabled, given the composite of some of your initial partner base?
Absolutely. So there's a couple ways of looking at this. One, there are companies out there that are helping identify underused grid capacity. So GridCare is one out of Stanford doing really interesting work to help data center developers understand where are the parts of the grid where we have this extra capacity that we could tap. And I think this also ties into the broader point that most Americans are just thinking about the problems here and not the opportunities. And it comes back to what I was saying earlier, which is more load, increasing demand can be a good thing if it's done well, and can actually decrease prices. And I don't think people have really thought that through, because there's a misunderstanding about how the market works for electricity. And so if you can push more power through the grid you have that we've all paid for, it can put downward pressure on rates, and it can also enable new loads to connect faster. So that's another thing that this Brattle research will show. First and foremost, Americans can save over $100 billion if we prioritize this at scale. But secondly, and importantly, it can also enable economic development, because you have new loads, whether that's data centers, new manufacturing, all sorts of things that are going to need electricity in our country, that are waiting, that are stuck, right? Can be unlocked more quickly if you bring on more capacity through the grid we have.
Well, just to focus on that report, so $100 billion in savings, new economic development opportunities. I'm imagining those are both direct and indirect economic opportunities.
Sure.
Does it cover both, or is it mostly focused on the direct economic opportunities?
The report is really looking at, first and foremost, rates and what are the impact on rates. It also touches on a broad set of technologies that can help us get there, which I mentioned. And then also, what are some of the best ways to measure utilization, right? And I think that more research will be done on this in the coming year. We partnered with Grid Lab on this study. They're going to be doing more research on this. The Virginia legislation, as it's written, requires the Utility Commission to come up with grid utilization metrics that they're going to begin enacting. And so if we can get this policy in other states, there's going to be more work to be done on what are the ideal metrics, how do we measure this, how do we report it. I think we're kind of in an emerging moment here for grid utilization, which is exciting.
If we come back in transmission 2027, your coalition's now 1 year in.
Yeah.
We have one state with the legislation today. Are there others that have it? Is it Virginia at this point?
Virginia, assuming Abigail Spanberger signs the bill, which we think she will, because she proposed this legislation.
Okay. So feeling good, but this would be the vanguard of hopefully a movement across other states.
Yes. We'd love to have at least a half dozen by next year, maybe more states either enacting or seriously considering this kind of legislation. Like I said, it's a one-page bill, so it actually kind of fits in with a lot of the other priorities that we've been talking about here today.
It absolutely makes sense, and I think it's an easy metric to understand, right? Like, you have a very direct bill that can be introduced across the country, and you have a coalition now moving to pursue that. How about the coalition itself? Where do we go from here? Is it going to grow? Is this the core group? What's the expectation?
We're trying to keep a relatively tight group. Anytime you have a large number of companies or stakeholders coming together, there's a risk of too many cooks in the kitchen. So we've got a great group of companies that are very invested in this. And I think we're going to have a wide range of partners. Like I said, everyone from consumer advocates and utilities to all sorts of interests in each state who will work with us. So they may not be formal members of Utilize per se, but hopefully they can be allies in moving this policy approach forward.
Well, you can count the Atlantic Council in that community. For those that are watching that are interested to see more about this report and see what's next for Utilize, what should they know from here? Where do we go? Are you going to have a public report launch? Or?
Yes, you can check out our website, utilizecoalition.org. The Brattle study will be coming out on Thursday, so you should see more on this soon.
Great. Well, Ian, thank you so much for joining us. Really enlightening conversation. I'm a big proponent of policy entrepreneurial nature. So like watching you set this coalition up and get legislation across the finish line is really exciting. Thank you for your time today.
Thanks for having me.
And for those that joined us, thank you for your time as well. This actually closes out our discussion today for Transmission 2026. Thank you for all who joined and for all of our speakers. We appreciate your insights and engagement. Obviously, this is a consequential year for the electricity sector, and you know, we're talking about abundance, about affordability, about reliability, and that requires innovation and optimization. So I think we covered a lot of ground today. It's a part of the Atlantic Council's body of work. We spend a lot of time thinking through the power grid, energy, AI, the interconnection of all of these facets of what's going on to make us competitive, to make our partners and allies competitive, and keeping with the Atlantic Council's vision for a stronger future with our partners and allies. I please encourage everybody, we have the report on the wall, Expanding Transmission Infrastructure to Achieve Low-Cost, Reliable, and Abundant Energy by Ken Berlin and Frank Wiley that we're launching today. You can see that by using the QR code or going to our website to download the report. And finally, Ian, you, others in the audience, we will be hosting our Global Energy Forum. So the Atlantic Council Global Energy Forum will be coming back to Washington, D.C., June 9th and 10th. And I invite everybody to be a part of that conversation. It's our showcase event. These topics, we'll go even deeper dives on some of these issues, and we hope you're a part of that. So thank you again for making this a success, and look forward to seeing you all for Transmission 2027. Thank you.